Hello, and welcome to the Population Factor on EarthX TV. Global climate change is perhaps the leading environmental problem facing humanity today. How do human numbers impact climate change, and what role can curbing population growth play in meeting this threat? Here to help answer these questions is Dr. Jane O'Sullivan, Senior Research Associate at the School of Agriculture and Food Sciences, University of Queensland, Australia. Jane is a cross-disciplinary researcher with interests in environmental protection, agriculture, human ecology, and sustainable development. Her recent publications include Climate Change and World Population. Jane, welcome to the Population Factor.
Good to be with you, Phil.
Thank you so much. Do we have you up really early? What time is it in Australia now?
It's about 7:15 in the morning.
Well, that's not too bad. Okay. Well, thank you for coming on the show. Jane, you trained as an agricultural scientist and have done a lot of research in that over the years. What first got you interested in population issues and population and climate change in particular?
Well, I started focusing on population growth because I saw it as a fundamental threat to the people's livelihoods and security, particularly in least developed countries where fertility is still very high. So all of the other measures that we could take to help lift them out of poverty just can't overtake the pace of population growth that is really holding those countries back. So I discovered that not very much is being done about it, and I was very curious as to why this was. And I discovered it's not because we don't have good solutions, because we're actually doing a lot about it very successfully in the 1970s and 1980s. And since the mid-1990s, we've been doing less and less. And the rate of fertility decline in the world has really slowed to almost nothing. So I discovered that it was because people subscribed to a whole bunch of myths about population growth that just don't fit the data we've got historically. And we really need to expose those myths and get back on track about this existential problem.
So we'll get to some of those myths in a moment, but I just want to emphasize, you're not someone, we talk a lot about the IPAT equation on this show. You're not someone who poo-poos the value of new technology and new agricultural efforts and better management, et cetera. But in terms of increasing food security in the developing world, what you're saying is we have to look at the demand as well as the supply, or the world could be heading for some difficult times.
Sure. So with regard to agricultural technology, there's no doubt that those advances in industrial agriculture have allowed the global population to get to the level it is, which is about 7.8 billion people. There's no doubt that there would have been major famines in South Asia in the 1970s or even 60s if the Green Revolution hadn't come along.
Right.
But those technology, the technologies that are not responding to population growth, we would have had anyway, and we would all be benefiting from them more equitably across the world if there weren't quite so many people to extend those services to. A lot of the technologies that allow us to accommodate more people, they're not solutions to overpopulation, they're workarounds, and they have their own costs. For instance, the expanding dead zones in oceans are a result of the fertilizers that we're putting on crops in order to get high enough yields to feed the global population.
Right.
So, we can do it without the fertilizers. We can't stop the fertilizers running out into the ocean. We're working on it, and we're doing it, we're getting better at it. But see, these things, everything that we use to get more people on the planet has its own environmental repercussions.
And that includes, of course, climate change. So let's back up a bit and provide listeners with some background on that. People have increased Earth's average temperature 1 degree Celsius over natural levels, and most of that increase has occurred during the past 4 decades. According to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, what role has population growth played in that increase?
Well, the IPCC says that population growth and economic growth are the main drivers of climate change. And those two factors act on each other. They multiply each other. So you can't say that, you know, one's responsible for X percent and the other's responsible for Y percent. It's like two sides of a rectangle. You can't say that the area of the rectangle is the width is responsible for a certain percentage and the height is responsible for another percentage. They both act on each other. So the consumer behaviours that we have are very important to the amount of emissions that happen, but they're important to the extent of the number of people who are behaving in that way. And likewise, the population is very important, but it's important to the extent that people's behaviours cause emissions. So from after the post-war period, when we started using petrol a lot more around the world, the emissions started growing much more rapidly than population growth. So at that stage, it was the expansion of fossil fuel use that was really driving emissions growth. And then from about the late 70s through to the turn of the century, population growth was really accounting for the growth in emissions. Per capita emissions weren't growing globally. Then from about 2003, the emerging economies, particularly China, and now, you know, places like India and Brazil, the growth in their economies has really accelerated emissions growth. So these things play, you know, together in order to generate the emissions growth that we see.
So if we look forward then, what role might limiting population increase play in limiting future temperature increases and climate disruption?
Right. So the global population is still growing at about 80 million people a year. So that's a country the size of Germany equivalent that we have to find somewhere for them to live and food for them to eat every year. And if the remaining high fertility countries, which are mainly in Sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East and Central Asia, if they were to adopt the sorts of voluntary family planning programs that we saw in the 1970s and 80s in places like Thailand and Iran, then the global population could be about 1 billion fewer by 2050 and maybe 3 or 4 billion fewer than it would otherwise be in the year 2100. So we could be looking at 7 or 8 billion in 2100 instead of 11 or 12 billion. That's really worth doing, not only for climate change, but for the security and well-being of the people in those countries in particular.
But looking specifically at climate change, most of those additional people, as you say, are projected for the developing world. And as we know, people in the developing world, their per capita emissions are lower than ours in the developed world. So why should those of us concerned about climate change be concerned about population growth in the developing world specifically?
There are lots of reasons. And the first is that we want to reduce the impacts of climate change on the people in those countries. So you could see population action as an adaptation tool, because the more people there are, the more difficult it is to cope with adverse weather events in particular. And secondly, we want them to be able to get richer, and the fewer people there are to be raised out of poverty, the less energy and materials and land we need to be able to bring them a good quality of life. But possibly the most important thing to me in the climate change mitigation space is that we can't do it without reducing population from its current path. So the climate change modelling that the IPCC groups have done with the shared socioeconomic pathways has shown that even the most heroic efforts to transfer the energy system rapidly and shift our diets away from using so much meat, all of those behaviours together still can't keep the climate below 2 degrees of warming unless the scenario has a much lower population than the UN's current level, the current UN projection. So we have to do this. It's one of the things, it's not the solution to climate change. We still have to do all those other heroic things in a heroic rate, but we can't win unless we also work on speeding up the reduction in births where those births are still high. And even in the most developed countries, having one child fewer is the most powerful action that an individual can take to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions over their entire lifetime. There have been studies that show that having one child fewer than you would have saves more than 5 times the greenhouse gas emissions that you use in your lifetime. And another study out of Sweden, which looked at all of the developed countries, so the average saving was 59 tonnes per year for the rest of your life on behalf of that non-existent child and the non-existent descendants of that child. So it's not an immediate effect like not flying in aeroplanes, for instance, but ultimately the saving is very much larger than any of those other actions that you could take.
So that itself is a very important point for listeners who are wondering, what can you personally do to make a contribution to limiting climate change? The studies are very clear that the best thing you can do is have fewer children. One of the good things about that particular climate action is non-existent people, you don't have to sort of cajole them into doing the right thing environmentally. They simply do the right thing environmentally, nothing, and the world benefits from that. It's sort of a funny thing to say, right? Especially, Jane, I know you have children, I have children. It's a funny thing to say the world would be better off with fewer of them, but we really have sort of reached a point where we have to think about those kind of things. Climate change is just one of the many hints that we're getting from nature that we're either at or rushing past limits to growth. So as individuals, yeah, having fewer children can make a difference. But of course, we also need to be thinking politically about these things. And there are other studies which focus on sort of the macro view of this. For instance, one, the O'Neill and Baumgart's article from 2012, I believe found that simply providing enough contraception and family planning help and finding a way to achieve the UN's low population projections versus the median population projections to 2100, they found would provide 40% of the greenhouse gas reductions needed to keep us below 2 degrees centigrade increase. So again, it's not everything, but it seems as if the scientists are telling us that should be part of what we're trying to do.
Absolutely. And a lot of people say we shouldn't be talking about population in the climate change space because it distracts from talking about the behaviours of people in rich countries, and that there's nothing we could do about it anyway. The population's tapering off by itself, and the only things we could do about it are unacceptably unethical in terms of removing people's rights about how many children they have. And these things are both false. The global population is not tapering off by itself at the moment. It's been going at about 80 million per year for the last 50 years. And we are absolutely failing to do the morally ethical thing that is required of us in delivering reproductive freedom to the women around the world. There are more than 200 million women in the world who have an unmet need for family planning. That is, women of reproductive age who don't want to get pregnant this year or next year and aren't using any modern contraception. And more than 40% of pregnancies globally are unintended. So there's enormous capacity there to reduce births just by giving people greater freedom. But in the high fertility countries, there is also a pervasive culture of wanting large families that needs to be tackled, which is not to say that you have to force people to do something they don't want to do. You have to change what they want to do. And that's what the countries in East Asia did very successfully. As soon as people realize that the prospects for themselves and their children is so much improved by having fewer children, they're very happy to do that. It's just those messages aren't being put out at all anymore since the mid-1990s.
So, I mean, that's an important point to make, that over the past 40, 50 years, we have evidence from many different parts of the world that when you provide contraception to women and couples, they tend to use it, and fertility rates decrease often quite rapidly. And that doesn't have to be a coercive thing. In fact, it shouldn't be. It should be providing people the wherewithal to choose the size of their families. The UN, for at least the past 40 years, has defined access to contraception and family planning as a human right. So it's an important point to make, that affirming that right and providing the wherewithal for people to have that right is what we're talking about here. Let's get a little more specific. If you could counsel and the world's governments and get them to follow your counsel regarding population policy, what are the key steps that need to happen?
Okay, well, one step is really to know that just providing access to contraception is not enough. So I don't believe it's true that when you provide ready, affordable access to contraception, people choose small families. It has never got fertility below the replacement level, below 2 children per woman, unless small families are also promoted as being a desirable thing. So we really need to get back into that space of advocating family planning, not just providing access. And that's the basis of the major successes in the 1970s and 80s, which we are not doing now. Most women surveyed in Sub-Saharan Africa have heard about contraception, know where to get it, and are not using it for a range of reasons which relate to the desire for large families, the fear of side effects of contraception, because a lot of lies have been spread about side effects, and the disapproval of their husband or their wider family. We need to tackle those barriers to use, and we need to tackle the culture that is preventing people from doing what's best for them and their children. And one of the programs that has been making very good progress on a small scale in Sub-Saharan Africa are the population health and environment projects, which integrate family planning in resource management and livelihood programs within communities. So they show that communities really do embrace the idea that smaller families are going to be better for their future, because they can see the environment under strain all around them and they understand where that's coming from.
So you're making a good point, which is that access to contraception won't lead to population stabilization if people continue to want large families and continue to have them. You could flip that around, though, and you could say that simply telling people all the wonderful benefits they're going to get from smaller families won't work unless the substantial efforts needed to get everyone access to contraception aren't made. So, and we are in some cases talking about relatively poor countries. They might struggle, sub-Saharan African countries might struggle to get good health care to their citizens in general. So family planning help might be just one of the things that they fail to deliver. But again, there could
Absolutely.
be a
and
go
that's
ahead.
where there's a really big role for international aid, and always has been in the family planning space. And another reason why we need to have population in the climate change mitigation space, because we're talking about quite big transfers of money internationally from developed to developing countries to address climate change. And those flows are dominating the aid discussions. If you're not in that agenda, you're not getting money. And the amount of money needed for family planning is quite small. We're currently spending less than $1 billion a year globally in terms of international aid for family planning, which translates to less than $1 per year per woman of childbearing age. It's not very much. We only need to up that by, 2 or 3 times, just a few $1 billion a year. The sort of money my government in quite a small country is spending a month on coronavirus response. And you only need to do that for a couple of decades until the system is changed and you don't need to promote family planning anymore. So it's a very small investment, and the global community needs to get behind it, because there are countries that really don't have the means to do it themselves at this stage. But countries are reluctant to do it because they're listening to developed countries expressing concern about their own low birth rates, which is just nuts. It's the great triumph of the modern age that we've been able to curb population growth in the developed countries, and that has allowed us to deliver good quality of life to everybody. It's allowed us to clear the slums and get everybody well housed and make sure that there's enough water and energy to go around. But there's this irrational fear of demographic aging, of having too many old people and not enough workers. And it just doesn't come out in the economics that's what's happening. Whenever the working age population is shrinking, it just means that fewer people are unemployed. It doesn't mean that there's less work happening or the economy is suffering in any way at all. And yet those messages are so strongly discussed in the global media that the president of Tanzania, where they have 5 children per woman and about 2% of people are over 65, is worried about population aging and withdrawing access to contraception from their women, which is nuts, and we just need to get our heads right in the developed country and realize that an older and declining population is absolutely the best thing for our future, and we need to be leading by example for the rest of the world.
And really, if you're ever going to end population growth, you're going to have to go through that stage of having an aging population. And as you say, it's a function of our success, right? It's a function of giving people the freedom to choose how many children to have. It's a function of keeping people healthy enough to live to an old age. So clearly, curbing population growth could play an important role in mitigating climate change. If we want to keep climate change from truly disastrous proportions, it probably has to play an important role. Why then isn't this a more important part of governments' efforts to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions? Why isn't it part of the aid budgets that are flowing towards developing nations for adaptations? Why isn't it discussed among environmentalists?
I think they've been hijacked by a very successful campaign that started in religious circles, but has attracted a lot of well-meaning people who believe it, that population control is a misanthropic activity that is trying to repress poor people and coloured people and whatever. And they are pressing this myth that the people who want fewer people are anti-people, are racist, are eugenicists, or whatever name they want to throw at us. But what they're really trying to do is not allow women to have access to contraception or abortions. And they're co-opting a lot of well-meaning people to further that cause by suppressing the population discussion. And it's really, you know, a very perverse situation where those people who think that they're defending the poor from the population controllers are actually actively harming the poor by ensuring that they're in this trap of high population growth, deepening poverty and environmental degradation in those poor countries. So I just think that people are not brave enough to confront that taboo and to call it out for the evil that it is and the evil that it's doing in the world.
So this brings up huge issues around patriarchal control of society, issues around the failures of governments and elites to be able to see past just an endless growth economy as the model for an economy. But we are out of time. Jane, I'd just like to thank you for coming on the show and helping us maybe begin to break some of the taboos you mentioned by talking about the issues. Thank you so much.
Great, lovely to be with you, Phil.
Clearly, curbing population growth can play an important role in mitigating climate change. Limiting the number of emitters can help limit future greenhouse gas emissions. But in recent years, the international community has come to realize that climate change adaptation is just as important as climate change mitigation. With 1 degree centigrade of temperature increase already baked into the Earth system and more heating on the way, human societies will have to adapt to whatever amount of continued climate change we inflict on the planet. What role might population policies play in helping societies adapt to future climate change? Here to discuss that question is Kathleen Mogelgaard, a senior fellow with the Population Institute in Washington, D.C., where she works to promote responsible policies to address linked issues that are critical for sustainable development. These include population dynamics, reproductive rights, gender, climate change, and food security. Kathleen has been a policy advisor for Oxfam America, the National Audubon Society, and the Population Reference Bureau, where she assisted conservation and development projects in Africa and Asia. Kathleen was also the lead researcher and writer of the UN Population Fund's 2019 State of World Population Report. Kathleen, welcome to the Population Factor.
Thanks very much, Phil. It's good to be with you.
So let's start at the beginning here. What are some of the challenges societies will face in a hotter world confronting increased climate disruption?
Well, as you already mentioned, there's a certain degree of warming that is already baked into the system. We're seeing climate change impacts already with increased wildfires here in the United States this year. We're seeing increased heat extremes in many parts of the world, shifting precipitation patterns, floods, droughts, and extreme weather events that are really endangering human lives and our way of living.
So it might be hard. I mean, those of us who are living in the Western United States don't have any problem imagining the fires. We've been living with them for what seems like an awfully long time this summer and fall. But some of those other threats might be a little hard for people living in a rich country in the temperate zone to understand. So let's just talk for a moment about one of them, increased heat, and especially increased heat stress. The scientists tell us that once the daytime temperature increases to 32, 33, and above centigrade during the daytime, that can literally lead to heat-induced mortality for people trying to work outside. So if you're thinking about a tropical country where you already get a certain number of days during the year where you have those high temperatures, I believe the scientists say that at 35 degrees centigrade, that's just too much for the average human being. And if you project out climate change over the rest of this century, there are countries in tropical Africa, Asia, Latin America, where many, many more millions of people will be seeing those kind of temperatures. So, just one kind of example that where climate change could make it harder for people, especially poorer people, right, who don't have the wherewithal to either not work for a few weeks or to work in air-conditioned comfort, let's say.
Right. No, you're exactly right. Increased heat, the number of hot days, has a huge human health impact, particularly in countries where there's just not the infrastructure for people to be able to get into air conditioning. So we're seeing increased mortality due to heat extremes. We're also seeing a huge economic impact that comes from hotter days because it has a direct impact on labor productivity. Another really major concern with a growing number of hot days is the productivity of agriculture. Right. We're doing people are doing a lot of things all around the world to help agricultural systems adapt to a changing climate. But one of the trickiest problems with climate change is figuring out how to get crops to adapt to hotter temperatures. We've just not found a good way to do that in a lot of places. And for many countries where the majority of the population is employed in the agriculture sector, an increasing number of hot days can mean disaster for the economy and for people's food security.
And of course, when you talk about agriculture adapting, it's possible that wealthier producers with more resources can go to new techniques, new food varieties, etc. But I know in your work, you're also concerned with farmers who are just poor and just basically growing a crop to feed their family. Those are the people who might not have the resources to make those changes to adapt.
You're absolutely right. Some of the work that I've done, for example, is in the country of Senegal, where about 75% of the labor force there is employed in the agriculture sector. Senegal has seen a lot of challenges for their agricultural systems based on shifting precipitation patterns, unpredictable rain, really heavy precipitation events that can wash away crops, and where a lot of the population is dependent for their food security directly on the subsistence farming that they do. Not long ago, I was in the capital, Dakar, and went to a small village about an hour from Dakar to see what kinds of adaptation initiatives they are undertaking there. And it's really challenging because it is a very poor community, not a lot of agricultural resources. A lot of the farm workers in that area had pretty much given up on farming, migrated to Dakar to look for paid employment, leaving behind a lot of women really to do the farming with very little mechanized equipment to do so. In this particular village, women were carrying large rocks by hand to build a dike to help divert some of the water that would be coming through heavy rain events that they had seen. They were planting vegetative windbreaks to cut down on some of the high winds that had been coming through to blow down seedlings before they'd had a chance to really grow. And these women were extremely proud of the work that they were doing. They thought that it was going to hopefully help their growing season in the next round and that they would be better able to feed their families, but it's a real struggle.
Are poor people in Senegal, and is the government in Senegal worried about climate change? Do they connect up some of these challenges to climate change?
Absolutely. And Senegal, like a lot of developing countries right now, are developing what are called NAPs, National Adaptation Plans. This is part of the UN Framework on Climate Change Agreement, the Framework Convention on Climate Change, that all countries are putting together long-term, medium to long-term plans for how they will adapt to the coming impacts of climate change. This is a really critical exercise that Senegal and many other developing countries are undertaking to try to assess the risks to their economy and to their people's livelihoods that climate change will bring, and to plan for that, to get the planning mechanisms into place, the institutions, and hopefully the financing in place that's going to help them better be able to cope with the coming challenges.
So this was an outgrowth, I believe, of the Paris Climate Agreement in 2015, right? That either mandated or strongly suggested that all countries create these national adaptation plans. I'm curious, are countries taking that responsibility seriously? Are they putting a lot of thought into the plans? And it might be too early to say whether the plans are actually going to influence policy, but are they at least taking the plans seriously?
From what I've seen, they are taking the plans seriously. I mean, for many developing countries, they are faced every day with the challenge of climate change. They know that the changes are growing more and more severe, and they are seeing the way that their economy and their people are impacted by these changes. What it takes is a lot of resources to get those plans into place, and a lot of capacity, scientific capacity, social capacity, economic capacity to move these plans forward. The Green Climate Fund, which is the largest international institution that provides support for climate change activities in the developing world, is providing major sources of funding for countries to develop these national adaptation plans. So a lot of developing countries are in the process now of putting these plans together to really think through carefully and in an evidence-based way how their societies and economies and communities can adapt to these changes over the coming decades.
And if you think about how the international community is negotiating this situation, one big part of the puzzle that many people think has to be part of it is moving some resources from wealthy countries like the United States, like the nations of the EU, to poorer countries like Senegal or Bangladesh or what have you, to help them adapt and also to help them transition their economies so that as they get wealthier, their emissions don't balloon. So I guess the idea would be these adaptation plans aren't just important in themselves. There's going to be money, hopefully, in the pipeline to help act on them. And so how that money gets spent, whether it's spent effectively, both in terms of climate change and improving people's lives, could be very important for the future of Senegal or the future of other countries.
Absolutely. With climate finance, I think we'll see a lot of funding. We already are seeing a lot of funding going to developing countries to help them develop their economies in ways that aren't as polluting as many developed industrialized countries followed, as well as to help them bolster their resilience to the changes that are coming, which, as we know, is really, if we're thinking about fairness, that is a fair route to go. The industrialized world, which has by and large been the ones to create this challenge of climate change, is in a position now to be able to provide some assistance to developing countries who've had very little to do with emitting greenhouse gases that are causing these problems, to help them develop in a more clean pathway that will not contribute to growing emissions in the atmosphere, but also to help strengthen their resilience to the climate change impacts that they are facing.
Sure, and of course these countries, again, it's a little hard for those of us living in the wealthy world who haven't traveled to the developing world much to understand this. These countries just don't necessarily have the resources themselves to make these kind of changes. To, for instance, take a more renewable energy pathway as opposed to just burning the cheap coal that some of them have. So that's an important part of this component too. You know, if we really want to reduce our emissions, beyond the fairness of it, if these poor countries are going to be part of that effort, they're going to have some help from the wealthier nations. You titled a policy brief a few years ago that you wrote, "Building Resilience Through Family Planning and Adaptation Finance." Could you explain the argument that you made there?
Absolutely. So when we think about the ways in which countries will be able to adapt to the climate change challenges that they're facing now and the challenges that they will face in the future, it's really important to think about population dynamics within a country when you consider the ways in which a country will be able to respond to climate challenges over the rest of this century. For many developing countries, population growth remains high. Population density is intensifying in these countries just as climate change impacts are intensifying. So being able to understand what population dynamics are going on in a particular country and what that means for a country's vulnerability to climate change impacts is really critical. For a lot of countries, let's take Senegal again as an example, their population growth path is significant and it's going to exacerbate challenges there, particularly when we look at things like the agricultural sector, when we look at coastal resources, when we look at the kinds of extreme heat or extreme weather events that they will be facing. A larger population, a more dense population will be something that will exacerbate vulnerability for Senegal. So the first part of the proposal here is for countries to really take a closer look at population trends and to factor that into their adaptation planning moving forward. The second part of that is to more deeply understand what is driving population trends in a particular country. In a country like Senegal, for example, we know that fertility is really high. It's about 4.4 children per woman in Senegal. We know that rates of unintended pregnancy are high, and we know that the unmet need for family planning is high. It's about 20% right now. So that means 1 in 5 women in Senegal would like to be able to end childbearing or delay their next pregnancy, but they lack family planning to be able to achieve their childbearing desires.
Right, right.
So as we think about that issue, and we think about how providing services that women already want in the realm of family planning and reproductive health services that would enable them to avoid unintended pregnancy, that would have the effect of reducing fertility and slowing population growth over time. In addition, meeting women's needs for family planning makes women and families healthier. It will reduce maternal mortality. It will reduce infant mortality. It will help achieve a broad range of other sustainable development goals related to hunger, related to education, related to alleviating poverty. And yet we know there is this unmet need in reproductive health and family planning in Senegal and in a lot of other developing countries. So if we're thinking about strategies for achieving climate resilience and adapting to climate change impacts over the long term, understanding the population dynamics and understanding women's reproductive health and family planning needs can be a really important part of that. And as resources flow into countries to help with adaptation planning, to help with adaptation action, those are things that should be on the table as we consider the types of interventions that are going to build resilience and strengthen adaptive capacity moving forward.
So I just want to emphasize one of the things you said there, because it was very helpful to me to read that policy brief. It's pretty straightforward and understandable, the idea that if you're a poor country and you're worried about sufficient natural resources and water and food, if you have fewer people to worry about down the line, you might have a better chance to have less hunger or less water stress, etc. That part of the equation seems pretty straightforward in terms of helping adaptation. Fewer people make fewer demands on scarce or dwindling natural resources. But your policy brief helped me understand that there are other aspects of this too. Improved family planning, as you say, can improve maternal and child health. And in countries that are struggling with climate change or simply struggling to develop and dealing with poverty, that in itself can be a huge help in reducing harms down the road. And there are other aspects of this too. Smaller families, for instance, are often able to provide more resources to educate their children. That can help that family do better down the line as well. So what I liked about this and some other things that you wrote is that you tie these things together. As we think about adaptation in the United States, where we are, we probably tend to think of it mostly in terms of protecting good things that we have. We have enough food to eat, most of us. We want to avoid flooding that harms our nice homes, etc. In the developing world, it's a harder challenge, right? Because they're not just trying to preserve what they have. They are trying to improve their lives in very basic ways. Climate change is going to make that more difficult. And you make the case that financing for family planning could help these poorer countries to achieve that.
Absolutely. Investing in family planning, investing in the health and well-being of women and girls is a win-win-win situation all around. There are really no downsides here. And we have a large movement around the world that is working toward ending unmet need for family planning based on the rights of girls and women to have reproductive autonomy. It's something that is really critical for women, and it's codified in our international agreements that women and families have the right to be able to determine the number, timing, and spacing of their childbearing. And they have the right to the information and the services to be able to do so. Unfortunately, that right we're not close to realizing that right universally for women and girls around the world. Right now, there are at least 218 million women around the world who would like to be able to delay childbearing or end childbearing, but they lack the contraceptive services that help them achieve those desires. So we are not in any way talking about a top-down population control kind of approach here. What we're talking about is meeting the existing needs of women and girls around the world. And because we do have such a large movement of people who are really working very hard to mobilize the resources and the political will to achieve those rights for women and girls around the world. And we also have, on the other hand, a movement that is working very hard to reduce the impacts of climate change, to reduce emissions, and to strengthen countries' abilities to adapt to climate change over the long term. We don't yet see very much of a marriage between these two movements globally, and yet there are so many positive synergies there that could come about if we really are better able to integrate this existing drive toward investing in women and girls into efforts to really grapple with the climate change challenge moving forward.
So I'm curious why that is. This seems like just a strong argument, and there's pretty good evidence from around the world, different parts of the world, that if you provide family planning, contraception, if you improve educational opportunities for girls, these things can relatively rapidly bring fertility rates down, and countries have seen the economics and environmental benefits of that. So why aren't governments, for instance, making enhanced family planning a part of their adaptation, climate change adaptation planning? Why aren't we connecting those things?
As with many things in international development, institutions, individuals, researchers, program managers, we end up in these silos. We develop our particular expertise on a particular area, and somehow it can be really difficult to see the connections into a very different field. So we need to find better ways to bust out of these silos and talk to each other more. And also, I should say, with population issues, I think probably a lot of your viewers understand there is a fraught history when it comes to population issues. We do have terrible examples in our history of coercive population control measures. And I think that's had a little bit of a chilling effect for government leaders and other decision makers to even talk about population, that there's somehow, it seems like for some people, it's a bit of a taboo topic.
Kathleen, you've written that there's a strong correlation between the countries currently at greatest risk due to climate change and countries around the world with the highest percentage of unmet contraceptive needs. Could you explain that finding and what it means?
Sure. So there are lots of different ways to measure climate change impacts and climate change vulnerability. We can look at things like just the physical impacts of climate change, where we're likely to see more extreme weather events, where precipitation patterns are really altered, where drought and flooding may be the most impactful. And when we look at countries that are highly vulnerable to the physical impacts of climate change, we see that there is a pretty strong overlap with countries that continue to have rapid population growth rates, as well as high rates of unmet need for family planning. As we've talked about, Senegal is one of those countries, many countries in Sub-Saharan Africa, which are vulnerable to the physical impacts of climate change and have exacerbated vulnerability because of the economic and social conditions in their country, are also countries that have a high unmet need for family planning. We see that in parts of Southeast Asia as well. And to me, this just really tells us that the investment of resources in efforts to address unmet need for family planning is something that could have, again, these win-win-win benefits for efforts to achieve human well-being and sustainability moving forward.
Yeah, just to give people a sense of some of the numbers we're talking about. You've discussed Senegal, a country where you've worked. I'm looking now at some figures from the UN World Population Report from 2019. Senegal's population in 2019 was 16 million. Under the median UN projection, that's projected to increase to 64 million in 2100, so a 300% increase. Some other huge increases in Africa. Nigeria projected to increase from 201 million to 733 million, a 265% increase by 2100. And then in some Asian countries, we're also looking at usually not increases that high, but substantial. So Pakistan, for instance, 217 million today, median projection of 403 million in 2100, an 86% increase. Those are just the median projections, but of course, depending on policies, those numbers could go a lot higher or a lot lower. And so it's important for listeners to realize that we're really talking about some large numbers for these countries. And again, for the most part, we're talking about poorer countries, and often countries which, because of geography, could be hardest hit by climate change. I believe you've spent some time working in the Philippines as well. Could you talk about a little bit about this issue in terms of the Philippines?
Yeah. I don't know how many of your viewers may have been to the Philippines, but it is a remarkable country. It is a beautiful country. It's a country that's made up of more than 7,000 islands. And it is right now a fairly densely populated country as well. The current population of the Philippines is 110 million, and it is growing. The fertility rate there is about 2.7 children per woman. The fertility has declined pretty significantly in the last couple of decades, but there continues to be a pretty high unmet need for family planning. About 17% of women in the Philippines have an unmet need for family planning. So population is continuing to grow in the Philippines, and that presents a lot of challenges, especially when, because it is a country that's made up of all of these islands, and communities are living on islands that are becoming more and more densely populated. And a lot of these places too, the communities living on these islands are very dependent on the natural resources base right there for their livelihoods. So we're seeing some challenges there, but we're also seeing some really remarkable progress in integrated approaches that really incorporate natural resource management, coastal resource management, as well as addressing the health needs of communities to better be able to cope with the challenges that are coming. So in a number of communities that I have visited around the Philippines, we see some really terrific community-based projects where there is a fishing group, for example, that is thinking about how to manage fisheries, a fisheries reserve in their area so that they can continue to fish for decades and not completely deplete the fish populations. And within those same groups, they have discussions about family size. They have discussions about the different methods of family planning. And men and women are talking together about their child planning or of their family planning desires and how to achieve them and what that means over the long term, as they also are thinking about how to manage the resource base that they depend on. So it's a very integrated approach that is seeing a lot of success in parts of the Philippines. So it's exciting to see that happening, and we need more and more of that across Philippines and across the world, really, as we experience more severe impacts from climate change, which for the Philippines, because it's such a densely populated country already with a lot of communities living right on the edge of the sea, when there is sea level rise, when there are extreme weather events, that can be really harmful for communities that are just trying to survive. So it's exciting to see this kind of progress in the Philippines, where communities are really taking the lead in thinking about how to manage their natural resources, how to protect their communities, how to plan their families. But of course, more support is needed to scale up those efforts and to really bring them across the country in ways that are going to affect the long-term future.
It's wonderful to hear that kind of story coming out of the Philippines. Sometimes you hear less hopeful stories about family planning from the Philippines. For instance, resistance from the Catholic Church, most Filipinos are Catholic, resistance to contraception and family planning. I know there have been huge political battles fought over availability of contraception in Manila, for instance. And but the fight goes on, right, between people who see a connection between family planning, improving people's lives and protecting the environment, and people who really don't. It's interesting too, from my perspective, to hear about Filipino villages who are making this connection between, okay, how many children are we going to have, and are we going to be able to support ourselves and our communities. I think to a debate we've had in Fort Collins, Colorado, where I live, where environmentalists have been fighting the building of a new dam and taking water out of the river that flows through town. And you know, that's the usual sort of developers on the one side, environmentalists on the other. But both sides pretty much accept the idea that population is just going to continue to grow. And so I would say that we're not really grappling with the fundamental issues here. We're fighting over some important things, but we're not really asking how many people can we support in Fort Collins in the way that we want to live. So maybe we have something to learn from those Filipino villagers.
That's a really good point. And you know, getting back to the national politics in any place really, but in the United States or in the Philippines, we do see a lot of battles at the national level in the Philippines over access to modern contraception, because as you mentioned, it is such a strongly Catholic country. But there's a lot of progress being made in the Philippines to address the concerns about reproductive health and modern contraception. There's a really robust grassroots efforts in the Philippines to advance and support a progressive reproductive health law that helps protect women's health and infants' health and child health in ways that is evidence-based and based on the needs really driven by the grassroots of communities in the Philippines. So while the national debate, I think, takes up a lot of airspace, a lot of political attention at the national level, from what I have seen in the Philippines at the community level, they are moving ahead. And I had a very memorable conversation not long ago in one of the coastal towns in the Philippines with the parish priest for that community, who was so concerned about the health and well-being and the long-term survival of his community and their way of life, that he was very supportive of the integration of a wide range of contraceptive methods into programs that were serving his community. So even though we see this back and forth in political battles, often at the national level, when we get down to the local level and see that where communities are really just trying to solve their own problems, that's something where I think we see a lot of hope. It doesn't get sort of to the larger issue that you were just talking about, Phil, in terms of, you know, we can sort of try to protect our own communities, but there are global trends that are happening here that have impacts at the national and the global level. And I think we need to, beyond sort of taking care of our own communities, we need to be mindful of what those global trends are and think about ways that for us here in the wealthiest country in the world, are we pushing our government to provide resources for communities around the world that need them, so that we can have a more sustainable future for the planet and not necessarily just protect our own little corner of the world.
Well, I think that's a wonderful sentiment, and maybe we should let that be the last substantial word in this segment. From your lips to God's ears, as my grandmother used to say. Kathleen, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's been a pleasure talking with you, Phil. Thank you for your work in this area. It's really something that I'm glad we're having more and more conversations about these issues, and it makes me feel more hopeful for a better future for women, for a better future for children, families, communities, and the planet at large. Thanks so much.
Can we have you back on the show in the future?
I would love to come back.
Terrific. Thanks, Kathleen.
Thank you, Phil.